Okay, so I have mixed up a good bit of this red and the green to make a brown. So over here on my practice paper, I can see that I have this nice warm brown, and that came from the red and the sap green, the pinky red and the sap green. And I've mixed up a really big puddle. I am going to be using her as a reference photo, and you can see I have my Chromebook. It's open, and it's like sitting next to me. So if I tip the camera, you can see that she's right there, and my painting workstation is right here. The way to begin these portraits is we want to look at the face and identify what the lightest value of the tone that we need is. And we're going to paint that every place. So I'm just going to put a little bit on her face here where I sort of know it's going to be like darker. And I need to get a bunch of the paint out of my paintbrush. So I'm frantically rinsing. There we go. So I now have this nice, super light face, like skin tone that I am putting every place. I just went back and grabbed a little more water again. The great thing is that even if you can see I'm not being super even like neat about it, right? Because her hair will cover it. Any shadows that I make will cover. But I'm going ahead and just filling in every place with this super light. So like the lightest tone that I will need. So I had to like look at my photo and evaluate that color before I started. One thing that I can do right now while the paint is still wet, and this was in the like watercolor portrait painting tips that I posted to the Google Classroom, is right now while this is wet, I can bump in some darker tone, and I can see right away it's gonna super take over. So I'm going to try to be a little careful about where I put it, but at the same time I know that I'm going to be able to move it. This way feels scary to me, even though this is how she recommends that she starts her portraits. I just feel like I don't have the control that I want working this way. And I personally prefer to let the portraits, after that first light tone, kind of dry, and then to go in and build shadows that way. So you can see I'm kind of like getting rid of some of the spots that I just thought seemed a little too much. Like I said, I always feel like I have a little bit more control. Like this does give you a really soft fade. I added a little bit of blue in here just to let you know, because it just needed it a little darker. But at the same time, this way always feels a little too scary for me, just because it like spreads so far and so fast when you are mixing with the wet into wet method. So here is her, like her finger is here, and she has a shadow under her chin. So this is pretty dark over here. And it goes around her hand, and it's all fairly dark. Not that dark down here, but so you can see now what I did was clean my paintbrush out and squeeze it dry, so that I have this capability to kind of push the tone, the value around a little bit. This is a very dark shadow over, the closer I get to her hair, actually, the darker this tone gets. But because I know that the side of her face is still kind of wet, I'm being cautious with how far I push that. Just knowing I'm going to be able to manipulate that tone later. And again, this, when I'm taking paint off, this is my paintbrush. I've cleaned it, I've squeezed it dry, and now I get to move paint or pull paint away instead of add paint on. So always remember that that is kind of the push-pull of watercolor. It will always look scary to start with. It just is what it is. So you can see I've got a couple of different shadow sections in here. At this point, it is a wet, wet mess. I don't know that I can do anything else until, quite frankly, this dries a little, because I'm looking at, like, I don't have the control that I want with the watercolor. So I'm leaning towards letting it dry. Like, if you're really impatient, you can grab a blow dryer, right? You can make it dry. But these are always going to happen in like layers, in painting sessions instead of in all one, like, kind of go. You can't like power paint through a watercolor portrait. It just isn't how they work. But you can see that I keep painting, even though I say that I think it's too wet. And I'm continuing to add and bump some color around. Just looking at this as like a base layer for some of the values that will kind of help me build onto the portrait. She's got a couple of strange shadows on her face. Most of these kind of blend out and in, so I'm gonna really get them to blend out and in. But it is definitely a layering process. And then, like I said, remember this, I am using the same paint that you are using. This is not a brown that I happen to have all sneaky style in my palette. This is me using red and green to make a complementary color neutral mix. The same as I'm asking you guys to do. It really is the nicest way to create a skin color for a portrait, is to use that complementary color blend. She is going to have to dry at this point, I'm afraid. So that I can come back and add a few more of the shadows that I'm seeing. Some of this is from her hair too, so. And the next phase will be me starting to like refine some of those shadows and control them a little bit more. Also, I'll start to vary the color of my skin tone a little bit more as I continue to work on her face. So you can see she looks really awkward right now, really rocky. And that is all just a really normal part of beginning a watercolor portrait. But I just wanted to show you, start recording a video and let you guys see kind of first steps. And here's what first steps at Studio de Hughes looks like. Looks pretty scary right now. And know that that's a really, really normal part of the process, that it is going to look pretty scary to start with, and that we keep going, and that it's that continuation of the process that makes the portrait actually turn out. So you can see I'm working on her. Of course, I have to pick the one that has fingers. Of course. So you can see I'm working on building a couple of the shadows already into her hand. before I go ahead and quit and let it dry so that I can move on to some like more controlled, clearer shadows and a few more details. Always remember when we're working on these that it is a process of large to small. You don't want to get too detailed too fast, right? The temptation is always going to be that I want to paint like the fun bit, which is like her eyes and her lips, but that is definitely more of a final step and a gradual build in that direction kind of a thing. So don't be tempted to go too crazy and get too detailed too fast, because then you just end up fighting the portrait and not having a great time with it. So remember, work in layers.